If you enjoy what you hear here today, please consider supporting me on my Patreon page. Every dollar helps, and you get to see content that you won't see here. Chapter 36. Into the Everfree, Part 2.
Twilight, are you sure you're up for this?
Fluttershy asked Twilight while pulling back from the rest of the group.
You still hit the ground really hard when you fell. I just don't want you to overexert yourself. That is, if that's okay with you.
Twilight smiled at Fluttershy reassuringly.
I'll manage, Fluttershy. Don't worry. I'm more worried about getting those elements and saving Rainbow Dash.
Her smile fell away, and she closed her eyes.
We're going to have some things to talk about when this is all over anyway.
Fluttershy tilted her head slightly, a curious expression appearing on her face.
What about?
Twilight looked at Fluttershy before turning her gaze down to the ground.
Before we left Canterlot, I was desperately trying to find clues and evidence related to Nightmare Moon. I found what I felt was proof of her imminent return, but Princess Celestia didn't believe me.
She explained before hissing through her teeth when the bruise on her side started acting up. She came to a stop to let it relax before speaking again.
I tried to tell Rainbow, but she didn't seem to believe me either. At least, until earlier, just before we all gathered in the town hall for the celebration. What do you mean? Before we left the library, Rainbow tried to tell me something. We were interrupted by Spike, but looking back, I think she knew Nightmare Moon was about to come back.
Twilight sighed and rubbed a forearm absently against her shoulder. Fluttershy draped a wing over Twilight's back to comfort her.
Are you sure?
She asked simply. Twilight nodded shakily.
Yeah. When Nightmare Moon showed up, Rainbow didn't even miss a beat or hesitate. She was the first one up there, facing Nightmare up close and personal, yelling at her, demanding answers, and...
Twilight closed her eyes.
She didn't even bat an eye when Nightmare called her niece. Yeah, she loudly declared that Nightmare was no aunt of hers, but if she hadn't known about Nightmare Moon, there would have been fewer demands and more questions.
Fluttershy bit her lip, looking unsure of herself.
Well, I'm sure she had a good reason for not telling you.
Twilight sagged a bit more.
I hope so.
We got a problem! Applejack's voice called from a ways ahead. Get up here! Fluttershy and Twilight shared a look before standing and moving ahead at a brisk pace. Once Applejack, Pinkie, and Rarity came into sight, the two quickly ducked to join their friends behind the cover of trees and brush.
What's going on?
Twilight asked nervously, before Rarity pointed out past their cover. Looking that way, Twilight gasped. Standing in the middle of the road a ways ahead, growling and roaring in rage, was a manticore. Its lion's claws slashed out at some nearby vines, ripping through them like a hot knife through partially melted butter.
Oh. How are we supposed to get past that?
Rarity demanded in an agitated hiss.
We can't fight that thing and expect to win.
Why not? Applejack asked, turning to glance at Rarity.
Well, you may be the most physically strong pony here, Applejack,
Rarity began in an almost scolding voice.
But without good preparation, you'd be torn apart by that thing. Twilight's good with magic of all kinds, I've noticed, but she's hurt. I'm a fashion designer and don't know the first thing about combat magic. And Pinkie Pie is, well... Hi!
Pinkie Pie waved back at Rarity cheerfully. Rarity gave a charmed smile before looking back to Applejack.
She's Pinkie. She's great at throwing parties and making sure everybody has a good time, but I don't know about tangling with a manticore. And as for Fluttershy... Oh, wait, where is she?
Rarity suddenly blurted, sitting upright and looking around. Every pony joined her in looking and, sure enough, Fluttershy had disappeared.
Oh, she's right there!
Pinkie finally deduced, while pointing towards the manticore. Every pony looked and collectively gasped when they saw Fluttershy fearlessly marching right up to the creature.
Fluttershy!
Twilight shouted in alarm, scrambling from her cover.
What are you doing?
The manticore turned upon hearing Twilight's voice, spotted Fluttershy trotting up to it, and reared back to strike with its claws, an enraged, rumbling growl escaping its throat.
Shh, it's okay.
Fluttershy then cooed softly, while gingerly touching the tip of her muzzle to the manticore's lower paw. It froze and looked her over, confused, before she looked back up with an innocent, kind smile.
What's bothering you, big guy?
The manticore looked unsure, maybe even a little guilty, before settling back down onto all fours, except for its front left paw, which it extended towards Fluttershy pads up. An enormous thorn was revealed to have been stabbed into the very center of the manticore's paw. It looked very painful. Fluttershy's ears fell.
Oh, you poor, poor little baby. Here, let me help you. This might hurt for just a second.
She assured gently, before reaching out with her teeth and pulling the thorn from the paw. A loud roar of pain tore its way from the manticore once the thorn was loose. It reached out and yanked Fluttershy forcefully from the ground, glaring at her and roaring in her face. The rest of the group cried out Fluttershy's name in unison, ready to leap to her aid before they all fell still, looking utterly perplexed. The manticore was now purring happily while its long tongue bathed Fluttershy in enormous, thankful licks. The yellow mare in question was giggling happily from the display of affection. Getting the idea, the rest of the group began to make their way past the manticore. Twilight was the last one to advance and the first one to stop, waiting for Fluttershy. Eventually, the big creature put her down and then bounded off into the woods. Fluttershy came trotting after the rest of the group then, her mane now thoroughly ruined from the excessive amounts of saliva and tongue brushing that had been applied to it. As she passed by Twilight, however, Fluttershy let out a loud yip of surprise when, suddenly, she was yanked into a very tight and very relieved hug.
Oh my gosh, Fluttershy, don't you ever scare me like that ever again, you hear me?
Twilight said in a shaky voice, holding Fluttershy close.
I only showed him a little kindness, Twilight. I know,
Twilight breathed, not letting go.
but I've already lost one friend tonight. Don't become a second, okay?
Fluttershy blushed from the attention and words, but returned the hug all the same.
Okay, Twilight. I won't.
The canopy's getting thicker, y'all, Applejack said with a hint of frustration in her voice sometime later. We won't be able to see much before long. I don't suppose either of y'all has a light spell or something? She turned to Rarity and Twilight.
Oh, I do.
Rarity said with a smile, a blue ball of light appearing on the tip of her horn. Twilight went to protest, to say that she could do it just as well, but Rarity shot her a stern look and shook her head. Twilight took the hint, nodded, and kept moving. Applejack hadn't been kidding. The canopy overhead was growing thicker as they went. In only a minute, it had gotten to the point that Rarity's illumination spell was literally the only source of light. Twilight started shivering, the sounds around her becoming that much more noticeable with most of the area around them shrouded in perfect darkness. She thought she could hear something moving in the trees. Applejack abruptly grunted when her hoof stepped on a soft patch on the ground and sunk in. There was a wet squelch and splash before Applejack yanked her hoof back up. It was now covered in a thick layer of brown squishy substance. She was about to keep moving when an ear-piercing shriek came from Fluttershy. Applejack rolled her eyes while looking at the Pegasus in question. "It's just mud, Fluttershy. No need to panic." Oof! Her words were cut off when her front connected with an unseen obstruction. Applejack then too let out a frightened shout while backpedaling away from what she had bumped into. It was a tree with a horrifying face starting to push its way through the bark, twisting the surface and painting the seams around it with a crimson glow. The branches twitched and spasmed, looking more and more like vicious claws the more they all looked. The group collectively screamed, surrounded by these things and expecting an assault of sharp claws at any moment. Then they heard Pinky laughing. Twilight opened one of the eyes she hadn't realized she had slammed shut, to see Pinky, sure enough, giggling in the face of one of these terrifying tree-like monsters like it was nothing.
Oh, that's a good one. Too bad it's not Nightmare Night.
She chortled.
What? Pinky, what are you doing? Run!
Twilight shouted, noticing a patch behind the pink pony where she could very easily run away if she just took it.
Why?
Pinky asked innocently before reaching out with her hooves and grasping the edges of the mouth of the tree and pulling. They stretched like rubber.
They're just trees, silly. But...
Twilight tried, but soon fell silent when she looked closer. Sure enough, while the trees had some new holes and graffiti on them, they were still just trees. Pinky then hopped inside the mouth hole on her tree, reached out with all four of her hooves and started moving. The tree looked like it was talking now.
Hiya!
It chirped happily.
Does any pony want a cupcake?
Twilight couldn't help the amused snort that came out of her.
Okay, that just looks ridiculous,
she muttered with a mirthful smile.
Yeah, it does.
Pinky agreed before poking her head out of the tree.
It's just like Granny Pie used to say. A lot of things may look scary and dangerous, but if you know what to look for...
She pushed the frowny face of the tree into a big, happy smile.
You'll see that they're actually really funny looking. And when you do find them, just laugh. Laugh and be happy and that fear goes away lickety-split. Well, as fascinating as all of that is, darling,
Rarity began before clearing her throat.
How did you know that these are just normal trees with, some vandalization?
Pinky poked it and looked at Rarity like she was a moron.
It's a tree, Rarity. Trees don't usually move, much less attack you with big, scary claws. These funny things can't hurt you.
She then disappeared back into the tree and made it talk again.
Yeah, I'd never hurt a fly.
The whole group giggled and laughed in amusement. Applejack was the first to speak again.
Well, that makes me feel a whole lot better. But I think we should get a move on. How much farther, Twi? Oh,
Twilight looked around for a moment, recalling what she had read in that book.
I don't think it's too much farther. The castle is supposed to be on the other side of a big river, and I think I can hear it. Then get a move on, little ponies!
The tree announced before Pinky hopped out and started bouncing down the trail.
Yeah, let's go!
Sure enough, they found the river and crossed with no problem whatsoever. Rarity had briefly seemed alarmed at one point when they were crossing the river, claiming that she saw an enormous sea serpent down the stream a ways, but it turned out to be nothing, and the group kept moving across the shallows. Now moving through the last stretch of their journey, the signs of old civilization were starting to appear. They had found what had once been a beautifully paved stone path, long since reclaimed by nature, but all the same they followed it. They looked what looked to be a few old farmhouses covered up in the bushes and foliage, but none stopped to explore them further. Finally, the forest gave way to a massive clearing. From their somewhat elevated vantage point, they saw where they were trying to go. An old, ancient castle, once beautiful and formidable, now nothing more than a hollowed and broken shell of its former self. Most of the roof had caved in centuries prior. Towers had toppled and windows had shattered. Moss and viney growths covered much of the old structure. There was just one problem. The deep chasm separating the entire castle from everything else. Still, they had made it. All they had to do was figure out a way across. Fluttershy trotted up to the edge and peered down into the chasm before standing upright.
It looks like there's an old rope bridge.
Twilight looked and confirmed Fluttershy's assessment.
Yeah, there is. It fell on our side, though. Reattaching it's gonna prove difficult.
Rarity hummed while giving the offending and broken creation a once-over.
Fluttershy, dear, do you think you can pull the other end back to those posts on the other side of the chasm? Twilight and I can use our magic to tie the rope to the post once it's tied up. And we can lessen the load with our magic, too, so it shouldn't be too heavy.
Twilight added with a confident and eager smile. Fluttershy gulped but nodded.
Alright, I'll try,
she said meekly, before turning and lifting into the air on her wings.
Be careful,
Twilight called after her as she went. Once the group saw the bridge shifting from Fluttershy's efforts, Rarity and Twilight nodded at each other before lighting their horns with magic and helping Fluttershy with the weight of the bridge. Slowly but surely, with a lot of grunts, sweat, and effort, the bridge was re-extended once more.
Whew! How does it look, darling?
Rarity called out once she and Twilight let go, having helped with the ropes as well as they could from this distance. Fluttershy gradually drifted back to them, looking at the bridge uneasily.
It looks lovely?
Applejack face-hugged.
I think she meant how sturdy does it look. Will we fall if we walk on it?
Fluttershy blushed lightly.
Oh, then, I don't think so. Only one way to find out,
Pinky said enthusiastically before setting off down the bridge while humming to herself. Carefully, the rest of the group set off down the bridge after her. It swayed and creaked dangerously under their weight, making them all stop more than once, worried about a collapse. Fluttershy slowly flew alongside them, hooves off the bridge to decrease the load.
Come on, you slowpokes,
Pinky called near the front of the bridge.
We're almost... Ah!
Her playful taunting turned into a scared scream when a wisp of black and purple smoke shot past her.
It's Nightmare Moon!
Twilight shouted in a fright, breaking into a gallop.
Every pony, move!
Her words came too late. From the cloud of smoke, the head of Nightmare Moon did indeed emerge, baring her fangs threateningly. She dug her teeth into the rope of the bridge, severing it instantly. The whole construction jerked and fell somewhat, now dangling precariously at an angle. Applejack let out a shout as she lost her footing, just able to hook her forelegs through some rope in time to keep herself from falling. Rarity was in much the same position next to the farmer, screaming in fear.
Applejack! Rarity!
Pinkie Pie shouted in alarm, turning and retreating back towards her friends along the bridge. Twilight passed her and skidded to a stop, looking back.
Pinky, no!
Twilight! Applejack called back, looking up and meeting Twilight's gaze. Go! Before anything else could be said, Nightmare's fangs sunk into the last of the rope, severing it and sending the bridge in two halves into the chasm. Twilight yelped and tossed herself back, her hooves grasping the ledge of the chasm and holding on for dear life. The cries of Pinkie Pie, Applejack, and Rarity vanished into the thick fog that filled the canyon below, their voices echoing into silence.
Pinky!
Twilight cried out in despair.
Applejack! Rarity! Girls, come on, say something!
She got no response. For a moment, Twilight just hung there, a horrible feeling building in her gut before she pulled herself back up onto the ledge. A few seconds later, Fluttershy settled down next to her eyes blank and unfocused.
I'm so sorry. Hey, Fluttershy.
Twilight cut her off gently, looking her friend in the eye.
You can fly. I can't. Get down there and see if they're okay. If they are, find a way to get them up here.
She then turned her gaze to look at the imposing castle. Her eyes narrowed when she saw that cloud of smoke flying inside.
I'm going to find the elements, and I'm going to finish this.
Fluttershy gulped slightly, her eyes wide with fear and uncertainty.
Are you sure about this, Twilight? Positive.
Was all Twilight said before reaching out and hugging Fluttershy one last time. She then let go and set off into the castle.